First, thank you to Joyce Harden for organizing and putting everything together. Snow got in our way, everything got in our way, and Joyce was calm and collected and has been a wonderful host. Also, thank you to Dr. Kada, to Africana Studies for organizing this, and thank you all, for finding time to come hear what I have to say today. I know that it's midday, you have classes and other things to attend to, so I appreciate it. The material I'm sharing today comes from a second book project I'm working on currently. My first book that Dr. Kada mentioned, Picture Freedom, Remaking Black Visuality in the Early 19th Century, is about the issue of Black freedom as a visual problem. How did people begin to think about looking at Black people as free? My second project is on the idea of natural hair as also a question of freedom and autonomy. So I'll share some material from the 19th century chapter of that book in progress. For Harriet Tubman's 1868 carte de visite, she sits in a full gingham patterned skirt with her textured coifs parted down the middle, twisted around the edge to smooth her hairs in place. Tubman's image appears in the album of Emily Howland, a white abolitionist and teacher, whose photograph collection included respectable-looking African-American teachers, veterans, and politicians. Hair and not just clothing helped Tubman signal her freedom. She explained in slavery that her hair had never been combed, that she managed it with food grease, and that it saved her life by patting her head from a slave master's brutal blow. Tubman's discussion of her hair and its role in her bondage underscores the material weight of Black hair, even in slavery, and invites us to think about its uses in signaling freedom. So my talk today shares a few ideas from the 19th century portion of my second book, New Growth, The Art and Texture of Black Hair After Emancipation. So I started this work with questions about the 21st century, about how Black women wear their hair today, about its representation in popular media, and I quickly found that hair comes up a lot in 19th century discussions, even among people who were formerly enslaved. Today I touch on a number of fugitive free Black people, such as Tubman, but I will primarily explicate my points about hair and slavery through the life and image of Frederick Douglass. Douglass had his image circulated in books and daguerreotypes as the most photographed American of the 19th century. I always say that. I think that's an important thing to think about. We think about photographic technologies emerging, and we don't think about how much enslaved people had access or were placed in front of the camera. But Frederick Douglass, even though he's born in slavery, no other American of the 19th century has as many photographs of them as Frederick Douglass. A key feature of Douglass's spectacular public persona was his hair, thick, long, and graying as he aged. Frederick Douglass's hair is no afterthought, as indicated by the way the style changes in his many photographs. A cursory glance of his images taken between 1848 and 1860 show his hair prominent, a significant aspect of his image, much like his clothing and his pose. Early images of a young Douglass show his hair parted on the side, dark in color, rippled in texture, and combed over. A mix of waves and curls are revealed by the style. The prominent side part, which Ginger Hill explains, quote, was the accepted gentlemanly fashion in contrast to middle parts of women's hair during the period, end quote. As Douglass aged, however, the part left the hairstyle, though his hair grew in length. Later images show Douglass's hair thick and eventually white in a full bush, complemented with a similarly full white beard. These changes in Douglass's hairstyle display a changing perspective about his appearance over time. So because Douglass is an icon with so many images, his hair and comments on his appearance are frequent because there's such a large archive to consider. But in the information I share today, I want to make the point that these issues can be thought through in other people, other examples, folks with fewer pictures for critique. Part of this work, one of my intentions in this work, is to situate hair theoretically and historically alongside the treatment of flesh. So when I started this project, I had some qualms about, after something like picture freedom, would hair seem important enough? How does hair let other people in? Why does hair matter? What could I say about hair that's not already been said, and not just sort of limited to the 20th century? Icons that we recognize like the Afro and Soul Train and things like that. And so I'm always thinking about slavery and how we live with the legacy of slavery, how we imagine freedom. And so I went to sort of canonic text in the field, and a discussion that I think gets treated with more seriousness, not I think, I'm certain, gets treated with a different kind of seriousness, is a discussion of the flesh and the body and what happens to the body. And so one of the goals of this text as I'm writing it is to sort of think through hair as not just a given, but to treat it with the sort of rigor and complication that we treat the body. In her seminal essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Hortense Spillers directs scholarly attention to a distinction between the body and the flesh. Spillers describes the flesh as that which, quote, does not escape concealment under the brush of discourse or the reflexes of iconography, end quote. Flesh registered the wounding of the Middle Passage. It is the entity acted upon as a primary narrative. It documents, quote, through its seared, divided, ripped apartness, riveted to the ship's hull, fallen or escaped overboard, end quote. One of the crucial contributions of the essay, Spiller's parsing of the body from the flesh, forces us to separately regard the violence against the flesh, which might be obscured by an emphasis on skin color, for example, but also the ways in which the flesh knows no gender under slavery. She points to the, quote, specifically externalized acts of torture and prostration that we imagine as the peculiar province of male brutality and torture inflicted by other males, end quote, and remarks on the ways in which these atrocities are also visited upon, quote, a female body strung from a tree limb or bleeding from the breast on any given day of field work. So Spillers does many things in this text. I highly recommend it. It's something I read over and over again and come to differently every time I read it. But two takeaways from Spiller's text that are relevant to what I'm sharing today is that first, she parses the elements of the body to think through slavery's impact. And second, she asks us to think about how slavery's violence is archived in the body. So think about some of the most iconic images of slavery that come to mind. Often they emphasize the body. And what Spillers is saying is that we have to think about what happens to bodies crammed in a ship, right? That's one kind of image. And then we also have to think about the crimes perpetrated against the flesh, the whipping, the scarring, the branding, the burning, as a whole other relationship to slavery's violence. And then lastly, how do bodies carry these histories forward into the future? So part of the work of my project is to think about the means by which Black hair might be a part of this conversation and do some of the same work that Spillers lays out. To think about Black hair as an archive under slavery is to think about what hair recorded about unfree persons' experiences, what hair revealed about slave or free status, but also to hold questions of aesthetics in sharp relief against material living conditions. This point of view asks us to take different positions on familiar photographs. Take the example of Gordon. The infamous carte de visite portrait of Gordon, taken in spring of 1863, showing the whipping scars on Gordon's back, is a visual study in texture and touch. This photo, made popular at the time through its reprinting as an Independence Day feature in Harper's Weekly, brings the viewer up close to the slave's torn flesh, never properly healed, ripped apart from the lash. Gordon's back forces the viewer to think through his pain, the blood that must have accompanied the open wounds, the suffering he must have endured waiting for them to scab and heal. Gordon, a runaway by the time his image was taken at a Union camp for soldiers along the Mississippi River, likely survived the harshest of conditions, both in his life as a slave and in his fugitive flight to freedom at the Union camp. The Middle Passage iconography of lacerated backs and torn flesh is written on Gordon's back and invite the viewer to rub the image to feel the texture of abuse. But Gordon's image also gives us a clear view of Gordon's head and his hair. His hair also bears the story of unkempt living conditions, the lack of leisure or personal time, perhaps even exclusion from a community of other Black people that might have helped care for his body and barber his hair. Matted and tangled together, Gordon's hair corresponds to his back and tells a story, a related story about violence, aesthetics, and autonomy. So my main argument today is simply to underscore the extent to which slavery organized Black hair texture as meaningful. We sort of take differentiations in texture as matter of fact, as a result of racial philosophies or theologies, and I want us to parse sort of how Black hair is made to mean as a result of slavery. This may seem like an easily acceptable notion. However, scholars have yet to parse the meanings of Black hair under slavery. Noliwe Rooke's groundbreaking work, Hair Raising, addresses advertisements for Black hair care products. White and White's essay, Slave Hair, lends runaway notices and slave owner testimony for a discussion of African American hair culture on plantations. And Franklin and Schwiniger, in their analysis of runaway slave advertisements, find that people described as, quote, mulatto or mixed race have their hair mentioned more frequently. But no scholarly monograph speaks to the ways in which formerly unfree people of African descent thought about Black coiffure. Toward this argument, I'll share 2 points related to Black hair in the period as exemplified through Douglas's experience. First, the point that Black hair was subject to violence and a source of haptic racism, much like the flesh. The historian Winthrop Jordan discussed the ways in which, quote, whites frequently referred to Black's hair as wool, end quote, a term used to denigrate Black hair, likening its thickness and curl to that of animals. Similar to skin, race thinkers theorized woolly hair as both an outcome of environmental conditions and a defense against the elements. This likening Black hair texture to that of animals fits among an entire haptic schema whereby the qualities of Black raciality emphasize harshness, coarseness, and the insensate. Historian Mark Michael Smith argues that, quote, slaveholders maintained that Blackness was not simply a color, but also a tactile condition, where Black skin, they argued, was at once thicker and tougher than white skin, and ergo much better suited to hard manual labor, end quote. So essentially I'm saying that hair might be placed in a constellation about other theories of Black feeling, that just as slave masters theorized Black bodies as able to do harsher labor, as Black skin able to endure harsher violence, so too did they set up a scenario whereby we think Black hair is able to endure harsher treatment as compared to white hair. Thinking about this construction shifts our thinking from one about the quality, good or bad hair texture, to instead think about how Black hair, like other elements of the Black body, was rife for mistreatment. A popular example of someone I've been thinking about since undergrad, Dr. Crystal Lucky presented to me for the first time Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And I don't know if folks have read this yet, but you should, and many times over. She has this sort of infamous runaway notice, which I have up here on the screen, which she explains through the text, and then also these scenes that she shares about the treatment of her body as well as her hair. Harriet Jacobs' experience is instructive. Her flight to freedom, misunderstood by James Norcom. Jacobs dons a sailor's clothing and blackens her face with charcoal, which is how she escapes his plantation. She dresses herself as a man, as a sailor, and though she's mixed race and lighter, she darkens her flesh to run away. So the runaway notice shows he's expecting her to try to pass for white to escape the plantation, and she does just the opposite. She presents herself as darker to go unnoticed. Norcom emphasizes her proximity to whiteness in order to assist in her recapture, pointing out that she is a light mulatto with thick black hair that curls naturally but can easily be combed straight. So he's expecting that her hair will be part of this performance of passing for white. But a focus on Jacob's mixed race identity might distract us from thinking about her hair and her experience of violence. So in her narrative, she also explains that in a fit of jealousy, her master shaves her head because he's worried that her hair will be part of her being regarded as beautiful and sort of taken away from him. She has 2 children by her master, and that's a whole other discussion about consent and sex and slavery. But my point here is just simply that while we might think of black hair for its distance from white hair as always already being regarded as negative and undesirable, an example like Harriet's having her head shaven as a means of control gives us pause and suggests that we should think about the creation of black hair as undesirable, as opposed to treating it as a given. Hers is one of countless stories retold by unfree people which recall instances where black hair was shaved off as a form of punishment. This violence that incorporated black hair helped to organize black hair as a record or a document of slavery's brutality. So in the book, I argue that, one, there are many more stories like this than I had realized, where people report having their heads shaven as a means of punishment. But also that we should think about if bodies can archive violence, right? If Gordon's back does the work of documenting for us the brutality he faced, how does black hair assist in that work? Frederick Douglass seems to have been thoughtful about this particular aspect of his experience, much like the rest of his appearance. Just as his image changed across 3 titles written on his life, offered with 3 different frontispieces, so too did his discussion of hair evolve. Sharing this piece here reminds me of, in Dr. Keita's class, talking about how many versions of Du Bois's biography he writes. And the same can be said for Frederick Douglass, that he has many versions of telling the story of his life, and the versions change from one point to another. Not drastically, but enough to warrant further consideration. Consider the way Douglass described his hair in effort to escape the brutality of Mr. Covey in his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, the 1845 text. Douglass describes running towards the woods after a bloody beating. Quote, "The thought of dying all alone in the woods and of being torn in pieces by the buzzards had not yet been rendered tolerable by my many troubles and hardships, and I was glad when the shade of the trees and the cool of the evening breeze combined with my matted hair to stop the flow of blood." End quote. Here, the texture of hair helps stop the bleeding, but also archives the brutality he faced by capturing the blood that would have dripped down, not for the density of Douglass's locks. When Douglass finally makes it to his destination to report Covey to his master, Captain Auld, his hair becomes part of the visual narrative he hopes to present, one of mere survival. Quote, on gaining my master's store, I presented an appearance of wretchedness and woe, calculated to move any but a heart of stone. From the crown of my head to the sole of my feet, there were marks of blood. My hair was all clotted with dust and blood, and the back of my shirt was literally stiff with the same. Briars and thorns had scarred and torn my feet and legs. Had I escaped from a den of tigers, I could not have looked worse. End quote. Douglas's hair, clotted with dust and blood, documents the strife he's gone through to get to Ald's. His hair indicates his inability to make himself presentable and the desperation with which he sought his master. Over time, the discussion of hair fades from Douglas's life writing, but in his images, his hair grows in length. His narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, 1845, his Bondage, My Freedom, 1855, but also the life and times of Frederick Douglass in 1881. This shifting treatment of his hair, I argue, organizes black hair as a demonstration of autonomy, that Douglass uses his hair to help signal his freedom. The hair that Douglass had increasingly become famous for, moving into the 19th century, may have also been a stance against what he knew intimately about slavery. Forcible cutting of black people's hair was not limited to women. Long hair was also considered a province of free persons, making short hair not just a punishment, but also a requirement. Thomas Cobb's An Inquiry into the Law of Negro Slavery in the United States of America explains, quote, long hair, being the badge of a freeman, was prohibited to slaves. Hence, one that permitted a fugitive slave's hair to grow long was subject to a fine, end quote. In Virginia law of October 1670, the General Assembly revises a law from the previous year establishing a large reward for anyone who captures a runaway slave or servant. A reward of 1,000 pounds of tobacco is reduced to 200 pounds. Repeat offenders are directed to, quote, keep their hair cut close, whereas free persons, including runaways, kept long hair. Cutting black hair close to the scalp was used to signify people as property. These laws, in part, were also about removing black people's individuality, as might be accentuated through hairstyling. So the point I'm making in sharing that is that Douglas's hair and the thought is a part of the thoughtfulness he gave to his appearance, which we know from how many pictures he took, but also that the choices he made about his hair in particular are wedded to a context where black people are having their heads shaved as a means of punishment and control, and to signify their civil status as free or not, as runaway or not. Douglass may have maintained the length of his hair as a symbol of his autonomy, I argue. Douglass is known to have given some consideration to his hair as a tool of racialization. Piecing together elements of Douglass's life through speeches and letters, Frederick May Holland included an interesting incident in his Frederick Douglass, the Colored Orator. Excerpted from a contributor's letter, Douglass is said to have retold of an encounter where his blackness could not deter a presumably white passenger from electing to sit beside him. The excerpt I have on the slide indicates Douglass using his hair. Quote, I roused myself, took my cap as well as my shawl from my head so that my hair would be observable, thinking that would be sufficient to ensure me my resting place, end quote. So Douglass is seated on the train. He thinks he has 2 seats to himself. He covers up to go to sleep, and someone sits next to him, and he hopes just flashing a little bit of his hair indicates that he is black and this person will move away. One of my favorite examples so far in this chapter, because it gives insight into what I think is about black interiority, that black people aren't just always subject to other people's racial ideas, but that we have our own and we use those and make decisions accordingly. Stories about Douglass and Douglass's own retelling of his experience with reference to his hair suggest that his hair was not simply an accessory that propelled his notoriety. Douglas reveals that even in slavery, a hair story is also a self-invention story in the face of suppression. In closing, what I think all of this material moves us towards is a way of thinking of black hair's materiality as a signifier of autonomy that begins even in slavery and not just in the 19th century. So what I mentioned earlier, this way of thinking that when we see lots of afros on TV in the middle 20th century, we think that something has been invented. And I'm arguing that even in slavery, we see black people making choices about their hair and having feelings about its texture that are socially and culturally relevant. Along these lines, black hair is a chance to think through slavery's impact on aesthetic judgment, to upend facile assumptions that black hair is always already undesirable because of its distinction from whiteness. Two things here. I think that there is a sort of justifiable reluctance to think about aesthetic questions in the context of slavery, right? When we know something is so terrible, we're sort of displacing questions about appearance for questions of politics or economics. But through this work, I'm hoping to make the case that we ought to dwell in questions of the aesthetic a little more, even in slavery, but also do away with the assumption that the differentiations between black hair are always already, like I said, one wherein black hair is thought undesirable. And then lastly, a chance to think through the meaning of natural, and not just how natural is meaning as a visual experience, but to draw on issues of touch, texture, and feeling, and not just the look of black hair. That's it. Thank you. Questions? Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you go back for a second to Harriet Jacobs?
Mm-hmm.
When her master, as a form of punishment, shaves her head, was it shortly after that she inverts that as a political thing and say, all right, I'm going to pass myself off as a male. I'm going to darken my face. And stuff like that. So there is that rebellion, resistance, and, whatever.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's such an interesting example because it displaces all the things that we assume, right? That people of African descent think the condition of blackness is a fixed one, wherein they can't move in and out of that in any sort of way, which we know isn't the case for other people, like Hannah Craft, the woman who escapes to slavery. She's mixed race. She and her husband, who is darker, escape where she passes as his white master and he passes as her slave, and they board a train. So these sorts of examples of people moving in and out of racial designations tells us they don't think it's fixed. But then also in the case of Harriet Jacobs, what I think is interesting about her example is that she plays on some of the things I argue in Picture Freedom, this idea that blackness is a kind of invisibility. And so by darkening herself to escape, she plays on the idea that her appearance will be less meaningful, that she will be overlooked by seeming blacker as opposed to seeming white. And I showed the ad because the ad tells us what he's expecting, and she does exactly the opposite. And then along those lines also, the gender piece, right? That she also assumes that being black and male will give her passage, that being white and female will not. So, yeah, thank you.
Great.
Thanks. Other folks?
So I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Being on a predominantly Caucasian campus,
Mm-hmm.
I'm African American. That at times where my hair out in afro, I use it as a platform for dialogue, a platform for education. What would you advise us on the campus?
Oh, that's a great
blend
question.
culturally to get to know each other differently. When it comes to
That's a great question. be frank, since the question catches me off guard. And approaching this question as one of not just visual, but also one of touch and texture, one of the first things that made me think about this is the problem of being asked if someone can touch your hair, right? That's a thing to never do, because it creates, it's objectifying, right? It puts a person in a position of being petted and sort of rendered spectacular, and that's not what we want. So I think it's helpful when people can shift curiosity to admiration and lead with that, but still sort of recognizing the differences between us can't be fully known all of the time, right? That there might be levels of understanding that aren't always possible to be reached, but one can still have a stance of appreciation even for that which they don't fully understand. So I think allowing there to be some lack of familiarity, but not problematizing that at the same time. I thought that was tactful. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
Let me ask you a question. I want to go back to the point you were making about a reluctance, but not altogether a refusal to engage in the question of aesthetics within the context of enslavement.
Yeah.
So, can you talk a bit more about aesthetics among enslaved people?
Yeah, there's so much there, and this part of my project is a true curiosity for me. I think the material focus on questions of enslavement often means thinking that people in slavery were in an experience of total destitution, had nothing, had no grounds for experimenting with appearance and aesthetics. But we also know that these people were making clothing, theirs and everyone else's, right? We know that things, what Michael Gomez calls country marks, that people's bodies were marked to indicate places of origin, and that they were in charge of caring for white people's bodies. So there's this way in which it seems like there's all of this fodder for thinking about what aesthetics meant to people under slavery, but because we think of aesthetics as having to do with leisure and room for leisure, then we often don't square room for aesthetic judgment amongst enslaved people who we know had little to no leisure. And so I'm trying to work through the hair in particular, along with other elements of the body, as an opportunity for thinking about their aesthetic judgments and what mattered to them. Yeah. It's helpful to talk about.
Can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about or approaching the visual sources when you don't have the textual pieces that go with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the case of Frederick Douglass, a sort of comparing changes over time. I don't have a source on his experience of sitting for a photograph all the time, although there is a lot of scholarship on his philosophy of picturing overall and his lectures on photography. So yeah, comparing pictures, sort of triangulating archival documents. So in the case of Harriet Jacobs, I don't have a lot, but I have the narrative, right, and all that we can critique of it. This later picture of her, as well as the advertisement. So sort of using sources together to think about or propose what meanings could be there that we've not attended to. Thinking about Saidiya Hartman and fabulation, sort of, proposing what the archive doesn't make plainly obvious. Yeah. The outtakes there. Oh, yes. Mhm.
What do you think? What do you think will ever be natural in regards to activity? Do you think we'll ever get around to like this history? Because right now it's not. I don't think we talked through like through the both like connecting the past to the
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate that question. Students ask me that frequently, and I think I have to work through that in the book. But I think, like many aspects of Black popular culture, it will be commodified to an extent that sort of divorces it from these other radical meanings. Um, but my thinking is evolving as to whether or not that means it should be dismissed. I guess maybe 6 months ago, if you asked me that, I'd say it'll be commoditized and it'll be useless and it won't, be very helpful to anyone of African descent. But a challenge I see in trying to write this book is to deal with, while capitalism persists, right? If we think about slavery as a capitalist project, through now, Black people's relationship to capitalism doesn't remain unchanged from slavery to now. So I have to think about people like Lisa Price of Carol's Daughter. She starts Carol's Daughter, has all of these financial troubles, but then sells the company. And so I can't say she was just wholly abused by a capitalist system, because she has agency and she's not enslaved, and these things mean in a different kind of way. Black people can be gentrifiers and all of these sorts of things we've talked about. So yeah, I think I think it already has changed from what it was 10 years ago when I first became curious about the contemporary treatment of natural hair. And I think it will continue in the face of social movements, chances to be an influencer, and do things on a smaller scale in a neoliberal environment. So, yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
You talked about how you have to like sort of divorce the system of like curiosity towards like more of like admiration, like getting to that point. But I guess my question is like, where do you stop the line of like admiration that gets to more of like
Mm-hmm.
fetishizing?
Yeah,
Like, where
that's a
is that
great
like
question. Mm-hmm.
line? 'Cause I
Mm-hmm.
feel like some like I have like wear my hair natural, but sometimes I'll wear it like in a fro, just like basically because my head is cold or something.
Mm-hmm.
And like I was just like I feel like it's such a fine line that you don't even really know where that is. So I guess I was wondering like what your
Yeah,
thoughts are.
yeah, that's a great question. I struggle with that, and I think for me, that's why I add the point about accepting things as unfamiliar, right? That I think that it's not uncommon to have an experience of, even if someone doesn't ask to touch your hair, to say, "Oh, that's great. I wish my hair could do that." And what do you do? And how do you sleep? And all of these sorts of questions that I think are about getting to a place of total understanding that just, whether or not it's possible, also isn't necessary, right? And so to me, the point of fetish is to take in the other, right? To consume it in its totality and sort of make it a part of one's own identity. And so, yeah, I think that's my point about allowing some distance to remain, that it's okay to not totally understand everything about another culture or person, and to sort of be okay with that, but that it doesn't have to diminish opportunities for community. If that makes sense. Thank you.